This is Speaking Freely with the ACLU of Pennsylvania. I'm Andy Hoover, your host and Director of Communications at the ACLU of PA. More than 20 years ago, Pennsylvania's Commonwealth Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to prohibit people who are living with a criminal record from voting in a case known as Mixon v. Commonwealth. The case overturned a 1995 law that banned people with felony convictions from voting for 5 years after their release from prison. Rules on voting for people with a record vary from state to state, though, and misinformation about those rights persists here in Pennsylvania. So for this episode, I talked with ACLU-PA Executive Director Mike Lee and Salim Holbrook, Executive Director of Abolitionist Law Center and a member of ACLU-PA's Board of Directors. Mike and Salim talk about who can and can't vote in PA based on their involvement with the criminal legal system and why it matters. This conversation was recorded on September 10th. Well, Mike and Salim, thanks so much for taking the time to talk. This is an issue that causes a lot of confusion, even 20 some years after changes in law in Pennsylvania that made it possible for most people with a record to vote. So I'm glad we have a chance to talk it through and talk about why it's important. Mike, I figure we start with you. If you can set the table and tell us what are the voting rights for people who have a criminal record?
Sure thing, Andy. And thank you again for lifting up this very important issue that impacts what some people estimate as 1 in 3 Americans, which is living with a criminal record. And first and foremost, when we say living with a criminal record, we're talking about people who have been arrested but not convicted, people who have been arrested and convicted, and people who may have been arrested, convicted, and completed their sentence. So you might hear Salim and I going back and forth between saying something like someone living with a criminal history, which is people with or without a conviction, and then more specifically saying things like someone living with a criminal conviction. So when we're talking about the right to vote, the real restrictions are placed upon people living with a criminal conviction. In fact, there's only 2 instances in which living with a criminal conviction impacts your ability and your right to vote. The first is if you're currently living in incarceration while serving your felony conviction. So people who are currently incarcerated serving a felony sentence are not eligible to vote. And the second category of people who have a criminal conviction who are ineligible to vote are people who have a criminal conviction for violating the election code within the last 4 years. But outside of that, if you have a criminal conviction or a criminal history, you are eligible to register and to vote in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and that affects so many people, whether it's people on probation, parole, people in halfway houses can vote. Now, they do need to vote absentee from either a past or present or a future address, past or future address, not present, but they can vote. People who are incarcerated pre-trial, of course, they have to vote absentee, but pretty much everybody except those 2 categories that you mentioned are eligible to vote. Now, Salim, you've had that experience of coming out of prison and you have actively engaged in advocacy work and in get out the vote work. Tell us a little bit about what that meant for you. Why did you decide that voting would be an important part of your life after incarceration?
Yeah, and just echoing Mike, thanks for sharing this platform so we could discuss this issue. For me, when I got out of prison, I like to tell people that everything from the amount of calories, a daily intake of calories a prisoner receives, to whether his or her death warrant will be signed are influenced by elections in Pennsylvania. What type of sentence you will get is influenced by election because judges are elected. Politicians are elected who draft laws and statutes and legislation that impacts your rights on a daily basis, not just incarcerated, but also formerly incarcerated. So for me, it was to have an ability to be a stakeholder in this process that has impacted my life so much, and more importantly, my community's life. And I also had realized too, from being incarcerated, that when masses of people mobilize, or when you have a good gravity of people that are mobilized, that can be something that can move power, particularly when it comes to votes. Call it a voting block if you want, call it an educated voter, call it a targeted voter. For me, I wanted to have a voice at the table. Now, don't get me wrong, at the table, don't get me wrong. I don't believe that my civic participation or my commitment and ability to change the system starts and stops on election day going into that booth. But it's one of the tools. It's one part of the tools in the toolbox that we are using to have a more just system in this country when it as it applies to formerly incarcerated people and currently incarcerated people, and how the carceral system, whether it's police, prisons, prosecutors, and even judges, interact with our communities on a daily basis. Because the Constitution may grant you your rights, but judges interpret them, right? And that's very important. And judges are elected in Pennsylvania. And that's something people aren't aware of. So, if you care about your rights, you should care about judicial elections, right? You should get to at least know some of the judges who are running, because someday, knock on wood, hopefully, but you could be in an encounter where that judge is interpreting your rights in the courtroom based on not even whether or not you committed a crime, but just your interactions with police, right? Because we know that there are various policing practices that could be violate your body, violate your rights. You're going to need a judge to interpret if that happened. And so making sure you have the right judges and having the right education about what you're voting for is important. So for me, from a broader standpoint, that is what really motivated me to engage the system through voting when I got out of prison.
I know that ALC has a Canvas program. You're engaging people who are living with a criminal history. I was going to ask you what your stump speech is, but that sounded like your stump speech right there. But can you tell us a little bit about those conversations? Like, tell us a little bit about the back and forth. I mean, it would be on its face, you could understand someone saying, "I can't see this system changing. Why should I participate?"
And there you go. Hey, listen. Philadelphia doesn't have a voter registration problem. Philadelphia has a turnout problem. Philadelphia has actually a very high voter registration rate. So our canvas, although we do have information on how to register to vote, and we have the QR code right there so that they could pull out their phone and register right there. The biggest challenge is cutting through the apathy, right? To talk to, like, you have a stake. So yes, I shared some of those conversations, or I guess you could call the stump speech. Another important thing is representation is really important. And so when formerly incarcerated see people canvassing the community, and we specifically target canvassers from their own communities, because that's who is going to connect. Because, hey, listen, it's election time. There's canvassers going through every door, every neighborhood in Philadelphia every day. People get turned off to it. Some people get annoyed at it. But when it's your neighbor, when it's someone that you know in the neighborhood, and particularly when it's someone who was formerly incarcerated but now is doing good things in the community, or is a part of that community, he's knocking on the door, talking about these issues. When he's knocking on the door, engaging formerly incarcerated people and saying, hey, you have the right to vote. You can register to vote. That really sets the stage for not just a conversation, but for someone to walk away and say, okay, if he can do that, I can do that. But also, like, a lot of people also are unaware of their rights. So a lot of times we encounter people who are like, nah, man, I'm still on paper, which means I'm still on probation or parole. And they mistakenly have the belief that they can't vote. And we're like, yeah, bro, like, the day you got out, you could have literally walked right across the street and registered that. You know what I'm saying? So for us, it's one part that too as well. And then in terms of, like I said, the issues for us are definitely our rights, rolling back the carceral states, less laws. Like Mike says, I think Mike has a saying, less laws, more justice. I really love that. Ending extreme sentencing. But more importantly, too, we want to talk about, living wage, right? Because one of the main drivers of mass incarceration or crime and violence in our community is poverty, and that poverty is structured. I believe that poverty is intentional, and I believe how police, prisons, and prosecutors and judges interact with the communities that are trapped in poverty cycles is deliberate, right? They treat these communities, our communities, different. It's intentional. So we have those type of conversations like, yeah, do you want to know why we're the most police communities? We have the most people incarcerated, but we're not the safest. Yeah. Now, don't get me wrong. Voting is not going to change that, but having politicians in power that understand that these carceral practices are not going to make our community safer. What we need are more resources for this community, more funding into our schools, rec centers, childcare, and people to advocate for a living wage, minimum wage. That is the issues that we really actually find the deepest conversations with, right? Because most folks are trying to make a living. And so those conversations really resonate. And what resonates is that, damn, I'm a part of this conversation, right? It's not just about police and prisons or jails. Like, I'm a part of a broader conversations of how our community should be governed and treated.
Hold up, Salim. You just opened up a beautiful bottle of justice, and we just got to let that breathe for a little bit because you just inundated us with so much impactful information. And I just want to back up one or two steps. And first, for me, I would say that when you vote, you're making sure you're counted and you're present. And someone who has been through the carceral system knows that one of the most important things they do is the count, right? And the only time you're counted shouldn't just be when you're incarcerated. So the same way you have to be in your cell at a certain time, or else there's problems on your end, right? The system is expecting you to be at your cell for count at least twice a day. Our democracy is expecting you to be at your ballot box twice a year in Pennsylvania, at the primary and at the general. And when you don't show up for your vote, you don't count. And when you don't count, you lessen the power of your community, and it's easier for you to be overlooked. So I really like the way in which you kind of wrapped everything together under the right to vote and access into all these other social resources and demanding of a philosophy of our elected officials. But how do we do that if we're only voting twice a year, right? Because elected officials all the time will say one thing and then say another thing and then say another thing.
And my reaction to listen to what you said, Salim, is that, voting is one piece of building the political culture and the political will to get to the policies that you're talking about. So it does make a difference in that if elected officials feel like this is where my constituents are, it motivates them to implement better policies. And unfortunately, it can work the other direction too. The politics in Philadelphia are a little tough right now. It's not just Philadelphia. Out here in the Harrisburg area, I'm seeing all of these ads about immigration, which are problematic. But we have a duty to move the culture, the political will in a particular direction. That's the whole reason why we do the work that we do. Mike, I wanted to ask you, the ACLU of Pennsylvania, our lane in getting out the vote, quote unquote, is election protection and know your rights. So with that in mind, what are the things you think are most important for voters to know in preparation for this election, especially voters who are living with a criminal history?
Yeah, that's a great question, Andy. And I think the main thing you need to understand if you're a voter in Pennsylvania are your county's rules. And we have a very decentralized form of elections. Every county has a board of election commissioners who can set certain criteria, like, for example, how many drop boxes you have, anywhere from 0 to 1 per voter if you could afford it, where those drop boxes are located. And very importantly, if you're doing a mail-in ballot, the procedures that are in place for you to make sure you voted correctly. And if you believe you made a mistake in how you voted in terms of filling out your form, giving you an opportunity to adjust your form or complete a provisional ballot. So I can't give you the specifics for how each of the 67 counties works, but there are resources available online, including on our website, ACLU-PA.org, for you to find out more information about how your county in particular handles procedures around elections related to mail-in ballots, where your polling location is, and so forth. The other important thing you can do is research your candidates. And we're a nonpartisan organization, so I'm not going to tell you which candidates to research or anything like that, but there probably are issues that are important to you. So Celine brought up an important issue of the minimum wage for work. If you believe the minimum wage is fine the way it is, I'm sure there's a candidate or candidates that may or may not agree with you. If you believe the minimum wage could be raised, then I'm sure there are candidates that may or may not agree with you. And if you think it should be lowered, there probably are candidates that may or may not agree with you. But it's incumbent upon you to check each of these candidates' records that you're planning to vote for to see how much they prioritize issues you care about, and conversely, if they have positions in the past on these issues. And the last thing I'll say, Andy, that's of extreme importance for this election cycle and voting in general, if you have a criminal record or not, talk to your friends and family about why they're voting, how they're voting, and when they're voting, so that you make sure that you understand what your community needs are. They might be a little different than your individual needs, but understanding how your rights relate to your neighbor's rights make us a better community and give us a stronger voice as we go to the polls. So knowing the rules in your polling station, being informed about the people on the ballot, and lastly, but not leastly, making sure that the information you gain from those first two steps, you're sharing with your friends and family and getting information from them about it. And the ACLU of Pennsylvania can help you understand where to vote and how to vote and what to do if you believe your ballot is in danger of not being counted.
And by the time this podcast goes live, it's possible that we're going to have some new information posted on our website. Our legal team has been gathering policies from all 67 counties, as you're describing, Mike, on how they how they approach certain voting issues. So, like, if someone submits a mail ballot and they didn't sign it, will they inform the voter and give the voter a chance to fix it? That varies from county to county. There are some things that are statewide. So it's statewide that everybody who is living with a criminal record has the ability to vote, except for people currently incarcerated for a felony conviction or have violated election law in the last 4 years. That's a statewide issue, but there are things, as you're referring to, that are administered and decided county by county. We've been trying to resolve some of those issues through litigation, but at the moment, some of them are still being implemented at the county level. And I'm hopeful that if once we get this podcast goes live, we might actually have that information on our website. So if we do, I'll make sure that we post it and folks have it available to them. But what Mike said actually segues into another question I wanted to ask you, Salim. And you kind of got into this a few minutes ago, but could you talk a little bit about what you think what are your priority criminal law issues that you'd like to see candidates face dealing with and prioritizing in this election?
That's a really tough question, because where do you start, right? And on what level do you start? Because, remember, we got municipal, state, and even federal elections going on right now. I guess for me, I do want to see. Let's take a step back or a step up and look for the presidential election. I'm definitely looking for candidates, and also in the U.S. Congress and Senate, that would really consider revisiting some of the more punitive and outright disproportionate laws that came about from the 90s, right? The era of mass incarceration. So we're talking about like the Prison Litigation Reform Act. Having something like that repealed that limits prisoners' ability to bring civil actions against their conditions of confinement. Look, Philadelphia County Jail is a horror shop right now. You know what I mean? Someone just died who was taken in from the streets of Kensington, who was an addict, right? And just died. I actually believe that curtailing and rolling back the ability of organizations like ACLU, the Abolitionist Law Center, and other groups that hold governments accountable, regardless to who's in power, right? And agencies, curtailing our ability to represent them, or even prisons themselves to sue, creates those types of conditions. So rolling something like that back, rolling something back like the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act in the 90s too, as well, that limited people's ability to actually bring legitimate claims of innocence or misconduct in the federal court. To overturn wrongful convictions is very important to me. So those are some things that I'm looking at, and I would like to see in candidates. But I would also like to see, like, and I'll just be straight, as someone who's a father, man, I need to see some help for people dealing with childcare, right? This what impacts me as I need some help, man, dealing with childcare, man. I need some childcare cuts or costs. So, those are issues that, like, and I said again, when you talk to formerly incarcerated people, you really be surprised. Yes, certainly we want to roll back the carceral state, but you'll see that our core interests, a lot of our interests are the same as everyone else out here. So on the state level, certainly looking for candidates that will, particularly on the state level now, like we got an attorney general's race. So we would want candidates that who would sit on the board of pardons and actually take a clean and real look at people who are deserving of commutations and pardons, who have rehabilitated themselves, changed their life. We would also like to see consumer protection, wage theft looked at, right? So because that impacts formerly incarcerated people, wage theft, So those are some issues for me that are very important as well.
Mike, I wanted to pivot to you because we've been talking about what issues are priorities, and we've been talking about how to move the political will, the political culture. We're going to have an upcoming episode of the podcast talking about a project we're working on, not only here at the ACLU of Pennsylvania, but the ACLU nationwide, and we internally call it our Narrative Change Project. It's a project where we are researching voter attitudes on public safety and also on immigration as two separate issues. We're going to talk in more detail about that on that next episode with some of our colleagues from National and our pollster. But you were on a panel about that issue and about some of the research. Give us a sneak peek. What are voters saying about how they want elected officials to handle public safety?
Sure. And Andy, for me, communications is always an issue because it frames how people approach what we define as a problem. And the narrative change work for me really reemphasizes that point I just made, because when we close our eyes as Americans and think of public safety, we think of Black and brown people causing harm and pain in suburban areas and not in big cities. When we think of immigration and close our eyes as Americans, we think of Black and brown people climbing over a gate in the southern border and not the larger realm of immigration. So as we think through and approach this narrative change work, it's important to remember that if that is our bias going into this, intentional or not, we need to be aware and conscious that public safety and immigration isn't just about controlling or restricting the movement of Black and brown people. The narrative change research shows, and to sneak peek, I'm not going to steal the whole thunder, but it shows very big picture that regardless of the political affiliation, what people are hungry for are solutions. And they don't want solutions that are rooted in prior failed policies or solutions that are masquerading as blaming people or labeling people. They want solutions that go towards some of the same things that Salim was lifting up. So if we want to reduce crime rates or recidivism, pay people more so they need to steal less, right? If we want to address some of these other social problems, then how can we increase the dignity and respect we have for our fellow humans so that they feel empowered enough to ask for the things they need instead of trying to take the things that they want? or flee into a situation where they're escaping danger only to find themselves in a more criminalized sense of danger. So the polling work shows that, again, regardless of your affiliation, if you're coming strong with solutions that center people and address underlying issues, you have a much easier path to an electoral win than if you talk about how tough you are or how strong you are at stopping this or preventing a person from doing that. And we all know the downsides of what happens when we blame people for issues and how difficult it can be to separate those two things once we start down that rhetorical pathway.
Well, Salim, this is at least the fourth time that someone from ALC has been on this podcast. And I have to say that every time someone from your organization is here, the listenership goes up. Your episodes always do really well. So if you could just tell us, where can people go to find more information about Abolitionist Law Center and Straight Ahead?
Well, thanks, Andy, and we enjoy this collaboration. I feel like this is just another extension of our collaboration in the courtroom and in the streets. So, the feeling is mutual coming on. If people want to learn about the Abolitionist Law Center, they can go to just our Facebook at Abolitionist Law Center, Instagram, Abolitionist Law Center, and also we're on Twitter, which is now called, I don't know, X or whatever. So if people are still on that platform, you can find us on there. And the same thing with Straight Ahead, our C4, we are also on all those other platforms as well.
Yes, there's much debate among ACLU affiliates about whether or not to stay on X, but you're absolutely right. There are still people there. So where the people are, that's where we go, right?
No doubt, no doubt.
All right, guys. Well, thanks. This is really a great conversation. I hope it's helpful for folks out there, and good luck getting out the vote.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Forget to vote. Take
Absolutely.
care.
Yeah.
That's Mike Lee, Executive Director of the ACLU of Pennsylvania, and Salim Holbrook, Executive Director of Abolitionist Law Center. To learn more about voting for people living with a criminal record, visit aclupa.org/vote. That brings episode 87 to a close. The editor of Speaking Freely is Natalie Montero. Our opening theme is by Moody Finn, and our closing theme is by Elliot. Both are courtesy of bensound.com. The executive director of the ACLU of Pennsylvania is the aforementioned Mike Lee. I'm Andy Hoover. Until next time, be free.